Hello and welcome. I'm so glad you've all joined us for this first session of the On Book Old Globe Shakespeare Reading Group program. My name is Danielle Mages-Amato. I'm the literary manager and dramaturg at the Old Globe. And during this time when we can't gather in the theaters, it gives me great pleasure to know that we can still gather around these great plays and find community in them. So that's what we're hoping to do in this group. We've got a really wide array of people in the group. We've got some teens and some tweens. We've got avid theater goers. We've got English teachers. We've got people who read Shakespeare years ago and are now just picking it up again for the first time. So we're really hoping that we're going to be able to have a conversation in the group that allows all of these different sort of types of people to participate and to really enjoy reading Shakespeare together. So later in the day today, I'm going to post some information about where you can get a copy of the play if you don't happen to have one in your house right now, where online you can get some copies, and where perhaps just maybe you might be able to get a physical copy still in this strange day and age. I can see your comments coming up on the side of my screen. So what will happen is that I'm going to start with our guest, and then I hope that you will post your questions in the chat. And after we talk for a bit, we're going to turn to those questions that you've posted and bring some of those into the conversation so that we can answer them. So as we start off this whole on-book experience, I thought it would be best to start with really the basics. Like when we pick up a Shakespeare play to read it today, what is this thing? You know, what is this book we're looking at? Where did it come from? And how can we best enjoy it? So I'm going to invite here, let's see how, make sure this works, technology. Great. So I'm joined today by Professor Abe Stoll. He teaches English. He's faculty member of English and Theater at the University of San Diego, where he teaches Shakespeare in the MFA to the MFA actors in our USD Old Globe Shiley Graduate Theater program. And he also works as a dramaturg on the productions there, especially the Shakespeare production. So hi, Abe. Welcome.
Hi. Thank you for inviting me, Danielle.
Abe and I had a moment before we started where we said, look, you know, this technology, this Facebook live streaming, it's new to everyone, at least to me. And if this goes wrong, you guys, if something crazy happens and the technology fails and you can't see us or hear us, what we'll do is Abe and I will go offline and we'll record this and then we'll post the video. So that's our sort of backup plan. So please let me know if for some reason in the comments, let me know if for some reason you can't see us or hear us, or if this thing sort of falls apart. So it's the brave new world of everyone in their living rooms communicating online. So Abe, thank you so much for being with us.
Well, I'm really pleased. I wish we could be meeting in the theater, but I love the diversity of the group that you just described. So I'm pleased to be with you all.
Great. Fantastic. So, I mean, maybe we can start with that question that I just posed. Like when I hold in my hand to open it, to read it for this group, a printed copy, say, of The Taming of the Shrew, or if I have it on my Kindle, when I'm looking at that text, how different is that from what Shakespeare originally wrote? How did that get from, you know, I have this image in my mind of like Shakespeare in the movie Shakespeare in Love with his quill pen, you know, writing plays. How did that get from being something that Shakespeare wrote to something that I can read today in 2020?
Yeah. Well, I'm afraid we might have to puncture your image a little bit.
Oh, no.
We can get back to that. If you have a modern text, yeah, some of the basic things to know is that, for example, almost certainly the spelling will be modernized. I just looked at the Folio edition of Taming before coming on, and you know, just in the first few lines, there's so many words already spelled differently. You know, pair with an E at the end, well spelled W-E-L. Just little things like that. So a modern editor will just clean those up because a modern reader would be distracted by them. So why mess with that? Punctuation also very different. In fact, in 16th and 17th century, the punctuation was very much non-standard, not the rules that we worry about today. And so you will see very different punctuation in a modern edition. one way to sort of describe that difference, though, is just to say that language was much freer in Shakespeare's day than it is today. In the 18th century, probably is where you would place it. People started codifying our language, saying, "Oh, this is how you spell it. This is how you use a comma." And in Shakespeare's day, there was simply a lot more space for variation and inconsistency, and I would say play, which is exactly what a poet would want. So there's a kind of freedom, I think, that might have been available to him that we don't always feel now. And so, we get a modern edition, and it is made easier by all of these standardizations, modernizations, but there's also perhaps something lost in the codification.
Well, I mean, I think now not only codified, but these are like, they're almost like an English Bible. They're like a literary Bible. Like we take them very, very seriously, word for word. And what you're saying is it seems like perhaps they started off as being not so precious in terms of every single word.
Well, yeah. And so two things. I mean, there's a process in which centuries of editors have come along and made adjustments to the plays. So you have, as I say, literally centuries of people, just people, I mean, smart people, but still just people making choices about whether to put a comma here or not, or whether to include this passage or that passage. So what we have today is a kind of palimpsest of a history of readings of the play. But then also, as I think you're talking about, even in Shakespeare's day, the text was a very unstable thing. So you say, how close is the modern edition to what Shakespeare wrote? Well, the problem with answering that question is we don't really know what Shakespeare wrote. This is not to say we think someone else, like Sir Francis Bacon, wrote the plays. It's to say that the texts themselves really were unstable. Shakespeare did not publish any of his plays in his lifetime intentionally.
So how would a play, say, have gone from, my romantic idea of Shakespeare writing it with a quill pen in a room, how would that play have even gone from Shakespeare's pen to like his actors being able to learn lines and study it, to then somebody being able to pick up a printed version and read it? How would that have even happened?
Yeah. So we think Shakespeare had what they often call his foul papers, which were his manuscripts, which presumably he did write with that quill pen. And they would then be turned into scrolls for each actor. And so actually, the actors wouldn't hold a whole play. They would hold a scroll that had only their lines in it. I mean, and it would have the one word, the prompt word from the previous line to tell them when to say their line.
So basically, like today's actors, we joke that some actors are just like, blah, 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 my line, my line. So it was like that. They had the blah, 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 my line version of the play.
Quite possibly. Then what happened is, so when after Shakespeare dies, several years later, in 1623, some members of his acting company produced the first folio. And some of the people who are with us today may remember just a few years ago when the folio came to San Diego, and it was at the downtown library, and the Globe was involved with bringing people in to see this amazing book. But so that was after Shakespeare died, so he did not have a hand in printing that. But before that folio, during Shakespeare's life, there were many Shakespeare plays printed, but these were all pirated editions. They're known as quartos, and mostly, almost certainly, probably all of them, Shakespeare had nothing to do with. In fact, he didn't want them published because he was in the business of selling tickets. When he wrote a good play, he wanted his actors to put it on stage and sell a ticket to come into the theater. He didn't want someone to be able to buy the book and go home and read it, right? Because that would cut into his business. It also was just sort of a sense, I think, they had that the theater had nothing to do with the printed book. People printed poems. We're talking early in printing history, so printed books are becoming more and more common in this moment. There are booksellers all over London. People are able to afford books and bring them home and collect them. And in that milieu, what happened is people started stealing Shakespeare's plays and printing off what we now call quartos, these kind of little paperback cheapo editions, and selling them for $1. Putting Shakespeare's name on the cover and selling them. For instance, Henry V, one of the plays that the Globe wants to do this summer, was printed in the Folio, but there were actually 3 quartos printed prior to that. And that's actually a mark of how popular the play was, most likely. They printed not 1, not 2, but 3 quartos because someone could make $1 off it.
So when they're printing quartos, are they printing those for people to read in their living rooms, or are they printing them for other companies to sort of steal and produce? Or what was the goal of this printing?
Well, that would be one of the fears, is that someone could steal it and produce it and compete that way. So there was fear in that, but they were printing them so people could read them. But of course the fear would be if you could read it, then maybe you wouldn't go see it. So there's both things. There's kind of a sense of a loss of control of the property. It belongs to the players and the playwright, Shakespeare's company. And once it gets printed, it's sort of no longer in their control. And the quartos also were, as I said, pirated and often rather quickly produced editions that had a lot of mistakes.
Where did the quartos come from? How did people get copies of the scripts to even publish them in quarto form?
So some of them, there's a lot of scholarship about this. People go spend their lives studying these things and come up with theories. We don't know exactly everything. So, these are theories, but some of the quartos are believed to have been taken from Shakespeare's foul papers, his manuscript. So someone got hold of the manuscript.
Like breaking into his office and stealing his papers?
I guess so.
Drama.
Some of them, memorial reconstruction. So in some instances, I think this is probably most common for the quartos, an actor who played in a role in the play, maybe a small role. So this person had a lot of time to listen to through a memorial reconstruction, sell it to a publisher or print house owner who would then set it and publish it. So there's different theories about how that happened, either memorial reconstruction or the foul papers. And then the third place would be a prompt book, which is, what the stage manager would have. And it would have all kinds of notes about stage directions and entrances and exits and that sort of thing.
Great. Well, what about The Taming of the Shrew? Is that a play that was published in multiple quartos, just in the Folio? What is its textual history?
It has a wild textual history. It has no quarto. So it was first published in the Folio. Another way of saying that is, if it weren't for the Folio, like The Tempest, we wouldn't have The Taming of the Shrew. That's the only place it survived. However, there is one really interesting play that was printed in a quarto edition in 1594 called not The Taming of the Shrew, but The Taming of a Shrew. And this was a play that had pretty much the same plot.
And is this the same, this is before or after the Shakespeare's play, or contemporaneous? We don't really know.
We're not quite sure. People place The Taming of the Shrew, the one where Shakespeare's play, anywhere from 1590 to 1594. And there's different theories about when to place it. And one of the significances of where to place it is the question of whether it's before or after The Taming of a Shrew. So The Taming of a Shrew was actually published in 94, but very likely was being performed back in 92 based upon some internal evidence they have about who the actors were. And so basically we have this play, Taming of a Shrew, which is about the same plot, has a few lines that are the same, most lines different names for the characters, and a couple pretty big differences in how the play works. And the scholars, the historians, are basically sort of in a long-term investigation as to what the relationships of these two plays are. One theory is that somebody else, it was printed anonymously, and one theory is that somebody else wrote it, and it was a source for Shakespeare's play. Another theory is that Shakespeare wrote it, and then it's like an early draft, and he rewrote it to make the Taming of the Shrew. And then another theory is the reverse of that, that Shakespeare wrote the Taming of the Shrew, and the Taming of a Shrew represents a kind of stealing or bad quarto of the Taming of the Shrew. So we don't know which way to do it, and people have their different theories about it. What you can take from that is simply what I was saying before, the instability of the text. You know, we're not talking about Shakespeare, the lone genius, with his quill pen, writing this, you know, writing Hamlet, writing Lear, writing Taming of the Shrew, as if it were some perfect thing that came from his pen down to us. We actually instead have this long, wild history of Shakespeare collaborating with his actors, writing and rewriting, most likely, people stealing it, it getting printed, editors coming along and changing it, and all of it coming down to what we have, which is, as you can tell, quite far from probably what came from his quill.
We have a question here. Let me see if I can put this up. Did Queen Elizabeth have any influence? And I'm not sure if that question is directed specifically to this play, or if it's directed at sort of Shakespeare's work in particular. Is that something that you could speak to at all? The influence of the royals of the time on the work that Shakespeare was writing?
Absolutely. I mean, she had an enormous influence upon everybody. She was the queen, and so there's no question that you know, especially in Shakespeare's more political plays, for instance, Richard II, there were really some strong ways in which the kind of as Shakespeare's telling history, in some cases, in many cases, people who were ancestors to Elizabeth, he was often having to tread very carefully around how history is told, making heroes out of the right people and villains out of the right people so as to not displease the monarchy. So, I mean, as just one example, there's nothing that Shakespeare could have done that he didn't have Elizabeth somewhere in the back of his mind. As for the question of taming,
sorry, go ahead. I was just going to say, is that something you... Go ahead, please.
I just wanted to point out that Taming of the Shrew is one of the most interesting and vexed plays in which to think about the patriarchy that existed in Shakespeare's day, to ask questions about how willing, or if Shakespeare was willing, to question patriarchal assumptions. Essentially, you know, the question of whether a wife must be utterly obedient to a husband. And you know, there are different readings of the Taming of the Shrew, and it's a very, it is sort of the crux of that play. Ultimately, whether one can find feminist readings in this play or whether it's hopeless to do so is sort of one of the great questions of this play. I think that pursuit is a fascinating question that has many different directions to go. But anyway, I just wanted to point out that he's doing that play. He's thinking about these issues of patriarchy and how a wife must be obedient to a husband in the context of a country that was deeply patriarchal in so many ways, and yet had a queen. And had a queen who refused to marry. And one of the main reasons why she refused to marry was because if she had a husband, then that husband would be her head, as the biblical metaphor goes.
So that's interesting. It's an interesting question to have come up, and then interesting to see how it might reflect on Taming of the Shrew specifically. Would that have been a play that would have been performed for Queen Elizabeth?
There's no evidence that it was, that I know of. Sometimes there's notices, little things written where this was performed in court. So there's no evidence that I know of that Shrew actually was specifically performed, but it's quite possible, because in addition to performing in the Globe, they would go perform in court for various occasions. So it was a common enough play that we could easily guess that Elizabeth sat there watching it. Yeah.
I'm pulling up another question here, which is sort of related to what we're talking about as we look at the text, which is, when multiple versions of a play exist, how is it decided which is published today? Or is there a version of each play that is considered standard by scholars? I mean, my limited understanding is that that's might be different for every play, but I don't know if you want to talk about it specifically for Shrew, or just that general question of how many versions and what becomes the standard version.
Yeah. Well, with a lot of his plays, there are not multiple versions. With a lot of his plays, there's one version that everyone feels pretty good about, and the other versions don't add or take away too very much. Shrew is one of those. As I said, it's only in the folio. So the textual issues aren't great unless you wanted to go back to the Taming of a Shrew, and that would be a pretty kind of deep scholarly dive into issues that wouldn't have much to do, I think, with, say, putting on a play. But if you were going to put on a production of King Lear, for example, which is one of the plays in which there are multiple versions, and there are significant differences between the versions, differences between the folio and the quarto versions, and those differences are such that if you pick one, you kind of sad you're losing something from the other. The result is that most editions of King Lear that people get, if you just buy a modern edition, is a conflation of the two. A conflation of the quarto and the folio, or they took a little bit from here and a little bit from there and they put it together. And so so what you have is this sort of beast that's kind of put together from the two.
So is that like if you bought, say, the Folger edition, it might be one Lear, and if you bought, say, the Arden, it might be another, and the Oxford, it might be slightly different? Is that true, or?
Absolutely, and there exist parallel editions. So so you can get a parallel edition that puts the quarto on one page and the folio on the other, and you can see where one has a big blank space next to the other because one is silent there and one is still talking. And but if you're going to do a production of Lear, you can't do parallel editions on stage. So you have to make choices. But the fact is, any production makes those kinds of choices all the time. So every time we do a production, as dramaturg, the first thing I do is cut the script, because most of the scripts are too long. We wanted to come in at 2 hours or something, and so we start cutting. It doesn't mean
now, is that because, like, Shakespeare's audiences actually sat through 4-hour plays, or is that an artifact of the text and how it got passed down, that somehow it got passed down longer than Shakespeare would have actually done it?
Well, it's debated. I mean, Hamlet is massively long, and it's just hard to believe that the whole thing got acted, because it's 4 hours if you act the whole thing. A lot of his other plays, probably could make it in the 2 to 2.5 hour range. And so we don't know. I mean, we don't know if. My assumption is that every production does cuts, just because. I mean, every production is a taking of the script and making it current for today, current for the actors who are on stage, current for the director, current for the audience. And there's nothing wrong with that. One of the things to take from what we were saying before about the text not being so stable, it's not being this, the text isn't this thing that came, like the Bible from Sinai, is that we can feel free ourselves to make cuts whenever we do a production. So yeah, the text is a little bit unstable, but that's an invitation for every production to make the play its own.
Let's talk a little bit about when we are reading it. And I mean, in a sense, when we're reading it, we're like making it our own, in our own heads and in our own minds, in our own mouths, in our own houses. I wonder what tips you have for readers of Shakespeare, for us in this group, as we start reading these plays. Like what advice would you give us to have the most enjoyable experience with the plays as we open a book to read them?
Yeah, I mean, I would say, first of all, before getting to tips, just that actually I think that this, in a way, this is a really lucky moment. Of course, we would all love to go be in the theater together and see the production, but taking the time to actually read the play is a wonderful way to open it up. You're just going to be able to get so much more reading than you can seeing. Now, it works the other way too. When I teach a Shakespeare class to undergraduates in an English department, we hopefully see a play or see some film, but we're mostly treating it as text, and it works very well that way. And I'll tell the students, you're missing out in not seeing it on stage. So ideally, you have both things. But if this is a moment to kind of encourage us all to just slow down and read, I think that's a wonderful thing too, because you can turn back a page and reread something. You can put it down and take a break and come back to it. You can check the footnotes. So it gives you a chance to just sink in a lot more than you would if you were in the audience. And I hope that all of you find this, if it's not something you usually do, and if by chance you have a little more time on your hands these days, it may well be a really rewarding thing to read.
Great.
But as for tips, right?
Yes, please.
Well, there's lots of different things you can do. I mean, one thing is to keep in mind what I was saying about the flexibility of Shakespeare's language with regard to spelling and punctuation. Also, another big thing I didn't mention but should is word order. Just the words come in a sentence in different order than what we're used to. If you keep in mind that freedom, there's a way in which, as you're reading, you can yourself try to be a little bit freer in your own reading patterns. Allow words to mean more than one thing. Allow them to come tumbling out of the sentence in an order you're not used to. Don't be dismayed when, in reading it, it doesn't come to you right away what it means. You'll have to kind of go back over it again. You'll have to sort of dwell in the sentence a little bit longer for it to come to you. I'm sure you all know, if you've read any Shakespeare, you sort of know what I'm talking about, that at first it feels a little messy and you're like, well, why isn't the meaning coming to me? But as you open yourself up to that sense of space and freedom and flexibility, you start getting better and better at it. And so the first tip I would give is just give yourself time. Just practice at it. Just keep reading. You quickly get the hang of it. I would say try not to get bogged down in the footnotes. I mean, they're very important to use. Don't be ashamed of using them. I use them all the time. But they can slow you down so much that you end up just slogging through a speech. And the strange thing is, oftentimes you're at the top of a speech and you're struggling to figure out what it means. And by the time you get to the bottom of the speech, actually it's explained itself to you. It's made itself clear. So the tip to take from that is sometimes it's better to keep the pace up in your reading, even if you're not understanding everything, because a lot of your questions get answered lower in the speech. And so sometimes it's better to read a passage at a pretty good clip and then go back to it and look at it a second time. So read it twice at a good clip rather than once really slowly would be something I would say.
Great.
And then lastly, read out loud. Just, when you get to a passage that really interests you or puzzles you, you can spend a few minutes with the footnotes. You can look at it a little more closely. And then when you think you sort of have an idea of it, read it out loud, and it really comes alive. It's really a wonderful experience.
Great. I'm going to take a couple questions from the chat here. If folks want to keep asking questions, please feel free to do that. Here's a question that's just popped up. Do you ever change words to make it more understandable for a modern audience? I'm assuming that's a production question. When the play is coming to the stage, is that something that, as a dramaturg of Shakespeare's plays, you ever find a conversation happening about, like, why don't we just say shirt here? Because otherwise, how will they even know?
Yes, sometimes that happens. Usually it's not just as sort of like straightforward as, well, this word, let's make it modern. But, as I said, we cut. And so oftentimes when we're trying to decide, okay, we want to make this scene a little shorter, what should we cut? Oftentimes what we cut is some really hard to understand sentence. We realize that, the meaning of the speech can be preserved without this sentence, and this one's really hard to understand. So we'll cut it. Sometimes modern words and make it in there. That's often has less to do with the dramaturg changing the script, and it has to do with the actors as they're rehearsing, improvising, because this is a huge part of it. They're beginning to inhabit the text. They're figuring out what they're doing with it. And sometimes they just come up with something and it's funny, or they come up with something and it's powerful, and everyone says, that's excellent, and let's keep it.
I will say that
probably how Shakespeare wrote also.
I'm sorry.
Shakespeare wrote that way too, through using the improvisation of his actors. That is to say, he didn't necessarily write all of those speeches. He may well have said to one of his actors, "This is the idea. Start talking," and kept some of what he liked.
And one of the things that's always very interesting to me as somebody who works in the theater and sort of in a lot of ways prioritizes the performance over the text, or at least makes them equal in importance, is this idea that writers like Shakespeare, like Moliere, wrote for specific actors, that these are speeches and bits and comic, little nuggets that were written for particular people. Like I think about something where, famously where there are dogs on stage, where it's like, oh, so-and-so's got a great dog act. Let's stick it in. Like I do feel like there are ways in which we read these plays as literature, and there are ways in which we read these plays maybe as a record of particular actors and particular people who came together to tell this story at once upon a time. And now in a way, we're trying to not only re-embody Shakespeare's words, but re-embody the clown who originally told that speech, or the actor whose lisp or whose manner of speaking created the rhythm of that particular language. It's really interesting to try to sort of like come to this not only as literature that was written for a neutral reader to read, but for a very active participating actor to read out loud in a particular room.
Yeah. And now those actors are all of you who are going to be reading, right?
We had a question here. Let me pull this up. Okay, so here's a question specifically about Taming of the Shrew. Is the first part of the Shrew usually cut? I don't want us to get too much into Taming of the Shrew here. I'm going to pull up on the screen with us like a little, you can see this first page of Taming of the Shrew here. I don't think now it's so small. It's so teeny. You can't see, you really can't see. So I'm going to take that off. That didn't really work very well. But you will notice when you do open this week to try to, here we go. Aha, here we go. This is another question on the same idea. Will the Globe's production of Shrew include any part of the induction? That's what I was going to mention. This Taming of the Shrew begins with this thing called the induction. Would you like to say anything about what this induction is, Abe, and why it might have been there and why we might not see it very often in modern productions?
Yeah. So when people talk about the Taming of the Shrew, they often just sort of think about the story of Kate and Petruchio and Baptista and all these, and like all this stuff, right? But actually, the play as we have it starts with a frame narrative where you have this drunk named Sly, who's a tinker, which is to say a very low profession, and he passes out in the tavern after breaking a bunch of glasses, and to play a practical joke on him, these lords come along and persuade him that he's actually a lord, not a tinker, and they dress up a little serving boy to be his wife, and they say, "You're a lord, and we're going to show you a play." And the play they show him is the rest of the play. So it's this absolutely wonderful frame narrative that does get cut. People are looking to simplify. They're looking to shorten. They're looking to make things really pithy. And the induction can be puzzling for people. People aren't quite sure what to do with it. I don't know what the Globe is going to do. Do you?
Next week, our first guest next week will be Shauna Cooper, who's the director for the Globe's production of Shrew. It's a play she directed last year at the Hudson Valley Shakespeare Festival. So she has attacked it before. So I'm sure she has a sense of whether she uses the induction in her production. And she might be able to answer better why that is something that often gets left out of modern productions. But go ahead, Abe.
I would add one thing. We were talking about that other text, The Taming of a Shrew. And the biggest difference between the Taming of the Shrew and a Shrew is how it handles the induction. There is an induction in the Taming of a Shrew, and Sly comes back several more times in the play, including at the very end of the play, when at the end of the play he goes, "Oh, that was really good. Now I know how to tame my wife." That gets cut in Taming of the Shrew. So one of the puzzling things about Taming of the Shrew, one of the reasons why I think the induction sometimes gets cut, is you have the induction at the very beginning. You have Sly at the beginning, and then he shows up for a brief moment at the end of Act 1, and then you never see him again. So it's like a frame that's asymmetrical. It's a frame in which the first half is there and the second half is not there. And that's a kind of puzzling thing dramatically, because you always are sort of like, what happened to him? What was up with that thing? If it just disappears. So in a sense, like, I think some people feel like, well, let's just get rid of the whole thing altogether. Me personally, I think the induction is the most interesting part of the play.
Okay, well, we're going to have you back to talk about that. We have one more question, and then I'm going to have us wrap up for this session. This last question we have, which edition do you recommend we read? Do you have any recommendations for a particular edition over another?
I wouldn't say that there's one that I think will do you better than any other. If you just want to know some of your choices, the Arden, 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 is definitely the most heavily annotated edition. Like this much text and that much footnotes underneath it. So if what you want to do is really sink into an enormous amount of commentary, get the Arden. You can get a single paperback. But I think that it works perfectly well to get any number of good scholarly editions, meaning they have footnotes, such as the ones done by Signet, by Folger, by Kittredge. There are a number of them, and so you just look and see: do they have a decent introduction? Do they have footnotes? And if so, I think it serves very well. Online, I would recommend the Folger. Go to the Folger library, and they have a set of online editions that I think are quite good. But the annotations are there's something weird. I don't know if you can download the annotations, if I recall correctly.
Yeah. Well, later today, I'm going to put a post in the group about links to different editions online, links to different Kindle versions of it that you can buy and download, or, Kobo or whatever book reader you use. And then also a couple of local bookstores who might actually be doing curbside pickup of books now that you might actually be able to get a hard copy even now. So I'll send that post around. I'll even probably link to some things like No Fear Shakespeare or whatever editions that put the Shakespeare and completely modernized language if it's something that you want to look at. But we'll do that later. Abe, this is great. Thank you so much for coming on and talking to us and sharing your expertise. Is really valuable. Maybe we'll have you log on to the group and answer any last questions that come up as people who weren't able to watch us live come in and post their questions. And we'll see if we can keep following up with the questions in the group. You guys, thank you all for joining us. It's been great to be here with you. We will be together again next week in a live format. We'll also start posting some discussion questions in the group for people to start having conversations. Like I said, next week we'll have Shauna Cooper early in the week. And I will post a schedule on Monday of when the live broadcast for the week will be. So that is all for now. Thank you again, Abe. Thank you all so much for joining us, and we will be together again soon. Take good care.
Thank you so much.
Thank
Bye.
you.